The following is a lecture by Professor Joseph Moore, hosted by the AI in the Liberal Arts Initiative. Scan the QR codes on screen to learn more, or go to www.liberal-arts.ai.
Welcome, everybody. First of all, thank you for the AI group for inviting me to give this talk. And thank all of you for coming, students in classes, students not in classes, colleagues, other people. Thank you all for being here. So this is a talk about the intersection between law, particularly intellectual property law, AI, and art. And I do know a little about art, at least the theory of art. In fact, my wonderful aesthetic students who are here and I are struggling to understand the nature of aesthetics and the nature of art this semester. I don't know very much at all about AI, I have to confess, and I don't know very much about intellectual property. But that's never stopped a philosopher from holding forth and trying to say something. So what I want to do today is, so I collaborated with a lawyer friend last year. He actually became a judge. And we wrote a paper that's coming out on AI and copyright law and artistic credit. It sort of brought together legal and philosophical considerations. Since that paper, I've been reflecting quite a bit on the arguments that we tried to make. And it seems to me that there is a deep conceptual puzzle that generative AI poses to the nature of art. It's such a deep conceptual puzzle that I rather ambitiously called an antinomy. The first version of this talk I gave in Germany, and so I started channeling Immanuel Kant. And Kant had this idea that, you know, these deep and almost irresolvable conceptual puzzles, he called them antinomies, sets of propositions or claims that each seem independently motivated but are in tension with one another. So what I'd like to do today is to review some of just one or two of the central arguments of the paper that I wrote, and then sort of develop the dialectic that surrounds one of the arguments, in particular, what I'll call, and I'll explain, I call the problem of the outputs, and try to show that there really is an antinomy or a conceptual puzzle that generative AI poses. It's not as grand as like Kant's antinomies of space and time and causation and stuff like that, but still, I think it's an important puzzle. Then I'm hoping, time permitting, to sketch some possible solutions and make some observations about the nature of this antinomy. When I practiced this talk this morning, it only took me about 3 hours or so. So I think I'll have to cut some stuff out. Okay. So I think sort of at the core of our notion of art and art making is a certain paradigm. Call it the one artwork, one artist paradigm. So a lone artist comes up with some sort of expressive idea or prompt, and through a sort of an intentionally monitored and adjusted process, tries to execute that in some medium and finally achieve something that has some sort of, is intended to be evaluated aesthetically, whatever that means, whether on an expressive grounds, formalist grounds. One artist working alone comes up, develops an artwork, creates an artwork. We have all sorts of examples that go against this paradigm. We have collective art making in the form of things like film, where it's not just one person, it's a bunch of people together making an art object. But still, I think something like this, but those are perhaps, they stray from this paradigm. And this paradigm, I think, is what's really challenged at the end of the day by generative AI programs. It's challenged, I hope to show today, in the legal domain. the legal debate about copyright in particular and generative AI is blowing up. It's on fire, and it's ever changing. It's changed since we wrote this article last year. But and I'll say just a little about the legal terrain. That legal terrain reflects a deeper, I think, conceptual puzzle that ultimately pushes against that paradigm. So just a bit about the legal terrain. There have been some recent cases, legal cases, and there are some going on right now. By the way, I'm restricting all that I have to say to the domain of visual art. There's visual image production that isn't art. There's art that isn't, of course, visual. There's music and other stuff. And there's much of what I say, I think, can be carried over. But there's also a lot of the legal terrain doesn't concern art at all. So New York Times sued OpenAI, and the publishers are suing places like OpenAI. That debate, that legal terrain mirrors in certain ways what's going on here with just images, visual images. So there's sort of two categories of legal contests going on here. There are worries and cases in which artists whose work is being ingested by these generative AIs are demanding consent, credit, and ultimately compensation. So remember, I mean, you all know this better than I do, but the AIs, the way they work, these new generation of AIs, they ingest or feast on over a billion, on the order of billions of images or data points. Those are used in a learning process, and then when prompted, they kick out some sort of an image that matches to some degree the prompt. So the ingestion of images is artists are suing for infringement of copyright because they're having their images ingested. Sarah Anderson, who wrote this book, and a bunch of other artists, and I think also Getty Images, sued Stable Diffusion. So the AIs that I basically know a little bit is DALL-E, but Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, these all sort of do the same thing. Sued the parent company for copyright infringement for their images. So again, just background, copyrights are if I produce some sort of a work, an image, say, I can get the right to distribute and sell that image uniquely. I have proprietary right, virtue of copyright, to do that. So if Liam looks at one of my images and copies it and sells it, I have grounds to sue him for copyright infringement. Copyright, though, is not an absolute right as it's treated in US intellectual property law. It can be overridden by various ways of fairly copying images or other intellectual outputs. So if I create an image and Liam looks at it and he says, that's such a stupid, bad image, and he uses a lot of it and creates a parody of it, that is often considered to be a fair use. It's a transformative use of my original image. So even though I have the copyright to the original image, Liam is able to override that copyright because he creates a new image. Okay, so on the input end, artists are suing the AIs. And so far, the cases have been unsuccessful. This was ruled against the plaintiffs. Then there's legal controversy on the output side. So if someone uses an AI to generate an image and then, say, posts it on their website or presents it, there's the question of whether they have copyright to that image. So Stephen Thaler, I think British artist, actually wrote an AI creative machine and used it to generate some images and petitioned the US Copyright Office. I think he did the same in Britain. For copyright to be attributed to the AI, was turned down, sued the Copyright Office, was lost. But there's cases of Christina Castanova on the output side, wrote a graphic novel, got copyright to the graphic novel. Then it was discovered that all the images have been produced by Midjourney. And so the Copyright Office retracted copyright to the images, but left her with copyright to the narrative. Okay, so I'm going to get into a little bit the legal reasons for these decisions, but I just want to distinguish those sort of two categories of contested legal terrain: input side, output side. And so far, artists and creators, or humans at least, haven't been successful in establishing copyright on either end. Okay. Now, in this paper, we actually staged an argument against the artists on the input end. And we didn't do it because we don't like artists. And there's lots of qualifications to these arguments. But there were sort of two arguments that we scouted. One is a legal argument, which I won't really talk about much, but the way the AIs use the input images is arguably transformative. They're copied into these AIs not in order to be spit out as they are, but rather to serve in this process of learning. And as we know now, there's a huge demand for new data for these learning machines in various domains. But the idea is that they were not used. They were not used to simply spit out those images and unfairly infringe on the commercial and sort of rights of the input artists. They're used for a different purpose. And that argument seems to be an argument that is holding up, although there's, as I say, there's qualifications and issues with it, which maybe we could discuss later if need be. But there's a second argument that we staged, more of a philosophical argument, a thought experiment against the idea that the input artists should have copyright or artistic credit for the images. And that runs as follows. So suppose there's an artist named Arda, pretty clever name for an artist, right? Living in Paris, and she's studying the works of the early modernist masters, particularly the Cubists, goes to all of the museums in Paris, of which there are many, and studies them, but also copies them, which you can do in a museum. You can set up your easel and copy them in a process of study. So she does this for years and years. Then she gets a fellowship to go to San Francisco and studies the great printmakers and printmaking from the Summer of Love, 1967, which if you've ever seen any of the artwork from that year, from that era, it really is beautiful. And she studies them, copies them. And then she becomes a professional and successful artist. And after years of practice, decides to make a image of hippie philosophers in Cubist style. So, and this is the image that Arda produces. Okay, we wouldn't, I think that Picasso or Braque or any of the Cubist artists, any of the San Francisco printmakers, any of the influences on Arda should get copyright or credit for this particular image. They should be mentioned in a biography of Arda and her art style. They certainly were influences. But art is, by its nature, involves borrowing, repurposing, perhaps even stealing from one another. And so there's no reason, I think, intuitively to think that, as it were, the input artists have any particular claim on the copyright or the artistic credit to this particular image, to hippie philosophers. Okay. Second case, there's an idol theorist, call him Theo, and he's sitting in his office one day. His office happens to be 302 Cooper House, which is my actual office, but this is a fictional case. And he thinks, wow, this is a cool program, DALL-E, and just sort of, without even thinking about it, types in hippie philosophers and Cubist style. Outpost this image, right? Theo posts it on his website, thinks it's so cool, posts it on his website. Even tries to get it printed out and exhibited in the Mead Art Museum. Okay. Now, weirdly, this is the type of case that the input artists are suing for copyright infringement. And this sort of argument on the input end that this thought experiment is supposed to bring out, I don't think it's conclusive, is that we're motivated to say that the input artists, in the case of real traditional image making, painting, say, have no copyright or artistic credit claim on the image. But here we do, and that's strange. Now, one of the explanations, I think, is that it's not clear who to credit for this image. Here it's clear. Arda is the artist. Arda should get copyright. Arda is, it's not at all controversial. Here, though, it's a bit of a puzzle, and I want to talk about that. And I think that actually makes the case for the input artists more compelling, because there's no one else to attribute credit to. Okay, I want to run with the output question, the question of who should get credit for, if anyone, for the output, for the image when it's generated using a generative AI. And there's an argument that I want to try out. It's really an argument from elimination, that there's no person or thing, there's no good candidate for credit, much less copyright, when we think about the output of hippie philosopher's star as opposed to hippie philosophers. Okay, so this is an argument by elimination. So who or what should we credit with that image, hippie philosopher's star? Ted asked, where did the image come from? So I actually generated it on behalf of Theo, but okay. Should the artists of the ingested images be be credited, get copyright? Well, we've just seen that there's some sort of argument to say that that's no more plausible than saying that someone like Picasso is the artist of and copyright holder of Arda's case. So it's not so plausible, I think, to hold that in the AI-generated case, the artists of the input images should be credited. As I say, there's some subtlety here that has to do with trademark as opposed to copyright and exactly what the prompt is. But at least if it's copyright to an image that just in which input artists are just used in the deep learning part of the AI, it's really unclear that that's more plausible. The input artists are more plausible credit bearers than Picasso would be. What about the programmers of DALL-E? Maybe we should say they're the people that should be credited with hippie philosopher's star, that image. Well, they don't need to know anything about art at all. I guess, I gather you can correct me, and if it was sort of explicit programming where you're putting in explicitly programming or coding rules that have to do with features of an artistic image, then maybe you do need to know something about art in order to get those, to put in or code in those rules so that they generate plausible images in the style of some particular art genre. But that's not the case with the deep learning AIs. You really, as I understand it, you don't need to know anything about art in order to program these AIs. And so it's sort of like holding that the inventors of the camera, of a particular camera, should hold copyright to a particular photo that that camera is used to generate. It just doesn't seem plausible. How about DALL-E? Can we say that DALL-E should get artistic credit or much less hold copyright? DALL-E is not such a great candidate for copyright and legal standing. But maybe we can sort of say that DALL-E should nevertheless be the thing that intuitively we credit as the artist, the creator. Well, it's not human, so there's sort of a speciesist reason to rule DALL-E out. But beyond that, it seems like DALL-E has this, and Midjourney and Stable Diffusion, the other AIs, have impressive capacities, but in a very sort of limited, domain-limited, in a very limited domain. They don't yet have the capacities to sort of intentionally understand, consciously understand the type of expressive goal that might be guiding the generation of a work of art, at least on the paradigmatic conception. So it's a stretch, at the very least, to say that DALL-E should be thought of as the artist. I'm going to consider some pushback later, but there's at least a prima facie case that DALL-E isn't a candidate. And what about Theo? Well, Theo doesn't do any work. I mean, it's just a sort of half-assed, type in a prompt and there you go. At least under copyright law, and this is interesting, there's this distinction between an idea and an expression of the idea. So at least under existing copyright law, Theo does know expression. So what does that mean? So suppose I come up with this really cool idea for a painting, a wounded stork, a painting of a wounded stork, say, right? And I go out to dinner with Liam and I tell Liam about it, and then before I even put pencil to paper or brush to canvas, Liam quickly goes home and executes that idea, generates a painting. I merely came up with the idea. That's not copyrightable under our current conceptions and practice of copyright law. Liam gets all of the, he can have copyright. He gets all the credit because he expressed the idea. So under the way things seem to be conceived right now, the prompter just comes up with an idea, types it in, and so can't count, at least under copyright law, as the expressor and therefore the copyright holder of the copyright. That's one of the reasons why on the output end currently humans are not being granted copyright. Okay, so it's very thin what Theo actually does here. And notice, just one more thing about the thinness of Theo. Theo doesn't really even know anything about the artistic features, the formal features that characterize Cubism, much less the history of Cubism, much less anything sort of artistic, visually artistic. Theo doesn't need to really know anything about. Just put in a half-baked thought in the form of a prompt, and bingo. You have an image that has all sorts of formal and perhaps even expressive content. Okay, so this argument is, as I say, it's sort of bi-candidate, and doesn't seem like there's any good thing or person to credit with the artwork. Okay, so if this argument is good, it leads directly to what I want to call the antinomy. So hippie philosophers, that image sure seems like a work of art, sure seems like the type of thing that one can evaluate aesthetically. It doesn't need to be good, right? But it's the type of thing that one can appreciate and evaluate aesthetically. And if you didn't know that it was Dali as opposed to Arta, the artist, I'm not sure you would treat the image any differently. That's the sort of motivation behind the first part of the antinomy, of the conceptual puzzle. Now, there's lots of things that things out there that aren't created by anyone that one can evaluate aesthetically, like snowflakes and sunsets and forests, and I'm thinking of natural stuff because I'm in environmental studies as well. But there is an aesthetics to things that aren't created by any particular human, at least. That's possible, but I think we would evaluate this as a created by some sort of agent work, and it seems like artworks are, in order for something to be aesthetically evaluated as an artwork and treated like an artwork, requires an artist. But we've just seen this argument to the conclusion that no artist created hippie philosophers. Okay, so I'm going to go on and sort of discuss the dialectic that surrounds this puzzle or this antinomy, but if I accomplish nothing else in this talk, I just want to sort of see that there's some, hopefully convey that there's some sort of a conceptual conflict that generative AI poses in the realm of art, at least. These three propositions all seem to have some independent motivation, but they can't be held together. So philosophers in particular hate contradictions, right? If I learned anything else about the law in investigating the law with my friend, I kept saying, but the law is contradictory. And my lawyer friend was like, so your point? And so contradiction isn't such a big deal maybe in certain intellectual domains, right? The law is this business of trying to sort of negotiate almost politically the different interests and considerations. But at least as a sort of philosophical matter, this is a problem. Okay, now I want to consider three different ways of responding to this antinomy, well, really to the elimination argument. I want to just consider them and raise some worries about each of them. But maybe some of these pushbacks on the elimination argument occurred to you. So one thing you could say is, well, I was pretty quick with dismissing Theo, the actual human on the output end, as the artist. And part of it was on the grounds that Theo really didn't do much. Certainly didn't do anything, as it were, formally artistic. And the prompt, the idea was half-baked. But you might think that there's other art that where it seems like someone is credited and credited importantly with creating an artwork where they really don't do much, if anything at all, to the art object itself. So in the mid-60s, as all of my aesthetic students know, Arthur Danto, the prominent philosopher of art and longtime art critic for The Nation, threw out this idea that well, maybe with certain types of art, particularly conceptual art, particularly with the type of art that was abundant in New York and in art circles mid-century. Art isn't about making particular things, it's about conveying ideas, it's about challenging, raising questions, it's about expressing something conceptual. So pretty heady type of thing for a philosopher to engage with and say. And so he pointed to, although didn't articulate, a so-called institutional theory of art, which was really developed by another philosopher, George Dickey, according to which what the artist does really is take some sort of object that they may or may not have some role in materially creating and turn it into an artwork by having it, by presenting it and having it accepted by the institutions of art as the type of object to be treated and thought about and appraised as an artwork. What the artist really does, particularly in these cases, is take something and say, look, let's consider this thing in a different type of way as an art object as opposed to anything else. This works pretty well with the most famous of the ready-mades. Duchamp's fountain is a urinal, right? It was a urinal. And on the type of theory, what Duchamp did, the artist Duchamp, was he did a lot of social work in order to get this thing into a gallery and get it to be considered as art. And that's not insignificant. More than that, the process of getting it into the museum and negotiating the art world transfigured the object itself. So we are meant to evaluate it differently. It's perceptually indistinguishable from a urinal, but it, as an art object, we might look at its formal features, its sheen, its shape, but I think more importantly, we might understand it as raising a question, or as making some sort of a social commentary, raising questions and issues about the nature of art. So what the artist really does on this theory is turn one type of object literally into another object on one way of understanding the object. So there's a difference between this as a urinal and this as an art object. Yeah, Rauschenberg's bed is another good example. A messy bed with a bunch of paint splashed on it. What Rauschenberg does is get it into the, doesn't do much work on the matter, gets it into the museum and into the art world generally, and it's thereby considered to be a work of art and is transfigured. We evaluate it differently. It's not just a messy bed, it's some sort of a commentary. Okay, so one thing you could do for poor old Theo is to try to apply this theory to Theo. So you might sometime, whoops. So you might think, well, what Theo does, he does something pretty significant. There's this thing, this image, and he turns it into a work of art. So if we're going to be sort of metaphysical about it, we want to distinguish hippie philosopher's star, the image, which is the thing which is generated by Dali, and hippie philosopher's star, the artwork, which is the thing that Theo transforms the image into. Okay, so I've just been sort of brainstorming about ways to get out of this puzzle. Seems to me this is a hard way to go. The institutional theory works maybe pretty well for conceptual art, but it's hard to, the difference between hippie philosopher, the image, and hippie philosopher, the artwork, is extremely subtle if you try to apply this general framework. Because hippie philosophers, the image is something that cries out to and has been generated to be evaluated as in a visual way. And that's the same with hippie philosopher, the artwork. There isn't this sort of background of conceptual expression or statement or questioning that's brought into existence by the institutional work that Duchamp did. None of that's really going on with Theo. And also, I think it missituates what is, I think, some real work that is still on the idea side of things that humans, prompters, can do with AI. So Theo just sort of mailed in a half-baked prompt, but people like Charlie Engman are using, and maybe some of you are doing this too. There's a lot of feedback. There's a lot of clever prompting and revision and stuff that Charlie Engman does to work with Midjourney to generate these images. So far, as I understand it, legally, no copyright possible for that for Engman, just like Theo. Second thing, I don't think that if your goal is to maintain credit for humans, you're not going to be able to hold the AIs off for very long. So with this theory, so here's my thought experiment: the art machine. I simply asked ChatGPT what would be a good prompt to put into DALL-E, and it spit something out. It spit out, why not? It said Cosmic Symphony of Planets as musical instruments. So I just typed that into DALL-E, and that's what was generated, right? So there, I really, I'm sure people already are. I mean, that's a very simple thing to get me out of the causal chain, to just link something like ChatGPT with DALL-E. And so you can imagine something like a screen that you have in your living room that every morning generates a new image to be offered up and to be appreciated in an aesthetic way. And the whole thing doesn't involve humans at all. Okay, that's the first pushback. The second pushback is maybe more relevant, is I think the most relevant for AI people. And that is to say, well, you ruled out DALL-E as the artist, as the creator. Maybe we shouldn't go so quickly. Maybe DALL-E is doing something that is sufficiently creative, or at least creative adjacent enough that DALL-E, certainly not capable of being a copyright holder, could nevertheless count as the main source of artistic credit, the artist, perhaps. Okay, and here's where I'll eventually go off the rails a little bit, but I've been trying to think this through. So the argument might be that hippie philosophers, that output, is sufficiently creative to count as an artwork because it's produced by a system with a sufficiently creative process. Okay, perhaps the work product, hippie philosophers, is sufficiently creative because it's novel and aesthetically valuable. But what makes DALL-E's process sufficiently creative? Okay, so my students and I have been looking at the notion of creativity, and it's a mess. What you really want to say about it is that we use the word creative in all sorts of different contexts in different ways. And maybe the best thing to do would be just to get rid of it. But it's the notion that's at the heart of legal and I think artistic practice. I don't think you can just eliminate it. One sort of distinction that I think is glossed over a lot when we talk about creativity is the process, product, person distinction. So sometimes we talk about products, as creative. We say, for example, hippie philosopher's star is creative. Sometimes we talk about processes as creative or not creative. And we can do that in domains other than where the product isn't necessarily creation. So in the realm of discovery, people sometimes distinguish between creative discoveries, like Mendel's cross-fertilizing pea plants was a very innovative, creative way to establish the existence of genes. Charles Goodyear, who discovered vulcanization, very uncreative process, just tried various different substances over a number of years to see whether any of them, when mixed with rubber, would harden rubber. And then one day, mistakenly, sulfur was left on a burner, and voila, accidentally, Charles Goodyear discovered vulcanization, but not through a creative process. And finally, we sometimes distinguish creative people and less creative people. Sort of like some people are more dispositionally creative than others. Okay, so if we're going to argue that it's at least halfway plausible that Dali could get artistic credit, I think we need to argue that Dali can count in some ways as creative. Okay, so there are sort of two ways to go here, or three ways to go. The line that we used in the paper was simply to appeal to the taxonomy of Margaret Bowden, who's a philosopher of cognitive science who's worked a lot on the notion of creativity. She has a very useful three-part distinction between types of creativity. I think sometimes she's mixing process and product, but the first type of creativity is, as it were, combinatorial. Take ingredients and you creatively combine them in almost a random way, and then some of them work out. So the concept of a unicorn is combinatorially creative. We have the concept of a horse. We have the concept of a horn. We have a concept, I don't know, do unicorns have wings? What? Okay, well then he's a flying horse. Okay. So we combine these concepts together, right, in a combinatorial way. Second form of creativity, and that seems to be the type of thing that these AIs, not even particularly sophisticated ones, are very good at. Second is an exploratory notion of creativity. So where there's some sort of a domain or a space of creativity, like an artistic space, and but the constraints on it are well known, and one creates a new instance of art within that creative space. So a Bach fugue. The fugal form is has rules, some of which Bach, I think, established. And a new Bach fugue is creation in the second, creative in the second sense. It's moving within a well-established space. Arta, too, cubism, pretty well. She pretty well understands what makes something cubist, and so she generates a new product within that exploratory space. That too seems like the generative AIs are very good at that. That's exactly the type of thing that they seem to be good at. Okay. There's a third type of creativity, which is the sort of creativity often associated with genius, which is transformational, outside the box, creating something new and valuable that's beyond the established constraints. So Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon is a possible example of that. It sort of paved the path to full-on cubism and broke down certain representational constraints. Einstein's special theory of relativity also you might think of as a transformationally creative theory. The AIs can't do that type of thing, at least not yet. There's actually some interesting discussion about whether that would be even possible. But they seem to be quite good here. Okay, so there's a sort of a, well, we have these different notions of creativity, and what they kick out seems to match them type of argument. But I want to sort of dig a little deeper and suggest two possible lines of argument building on this process-product distinction. So the first type of argument is an appeal to the similarity of creative process. And here I'm on very thin ice on the AI side, but people that study creation in humans, creative people in humans, and study their process, cognitive science, psychology, seem to think that there's sort of two stages often to a typically creative moment. There's the sort of generation of an idea or an image, and then there's the evaluation of it, the weeding out of certain possible things that are generated, and perhaps kicking it back and fine-tuning. And I don't even know if you need cognitive science to show that. That just sort of seems plausible to the way we think about the way we work. If I ask you to generate an image, to draw an image of a wounded stork, you might well think of various images or ways that that might go and execute them, and then if you cared, evaluate them, rip up some of the sketches, improve some of the sketches. So there's sort of a generation evaluation dance, two-step dance to human creativity. And arguably, there's the same thing with AIs. Part of these AIs. Part of these is a generative adversarial network. I don't totally know what I'm talking about, so you can inform me here, but there's something that generates possibilities, and then there's some sort of evaluative part of the AI that selects some of them and maybe kicks back and prompts for fine-tunings. They're trying to maximize match with some sort of a prompt. So the first type of argument here would be that there's a process similarity between human creativity and AI creativity. I actually am more drawn to, but that's to sort of look under the hood. I'm more drawn to a, almost like a neo-behaviorist line or something that well, really, how we distinguish a creative as opposed to an uncreative process is really, the evidence for that really is the products that it kicks out. So if I wonder whether, well, switching to people, suppose I wonder whether OSHA is a creative person. Sorry, OSHA, I know he is, but suppose I wonder, right? What type of evidence would I come up for that? Well, I'd look at OSHA's track record of creations, of things that he's generated, right? Could be mathematical proofs, could be images, could be ideas, something like that. And if the pattern of the products is highly creative, then I think that is the evidence that gets me to say that he's creative. So sort of, I'm inclined to think that almost our applying the notion of creativity to processes and even persons really is driven by their product. It would be weird if OSHA throughout his life generated nothing that was at all creative, and yet we still held that definitely a creative person, he never produced anything creative. It's weird. And that almost seems like, it's conceptually puzzling. So another way to go is to say that if you want to pursue this line, that DALL-E is creative because DALL-E reliably produces images that are novel and aesthetically valuable in a way that's responsive to an expressive constraint. So if you sort of vary what the constraint is, DALL-E will kick out a product that appropriately matches it. So there's this old thought experiment philosopher named Hilary Putnam who comes across, ants have traced tracks in the sand that bear a striking resemblance to Winston Churchill. And is that an image of Winston Churchill? One thought is, no, it's not, because the details of the image didn't depend upon Winston Churchill. If Winston Churchill had had a different face, the tracks would still have been the same. So it's not even an image that's about, there's a resemblance. There's in fact a resemblance between the ant tracks and Winston Churchill's face, but it doesn't count as an image of the face because there isn't that type of counterfactual dependence. The images that DALL-E produces, though, do have that, or the things that DALL-E produces do have that type of reliable dependence upon the prompt, upon what DALL-E's being able to do. So they certainly count as images. And they certainly, and it seems plausible to think that if we regard them as the products as creative, then maybe we should say that DALL-E is creative. Okay, now, problem with this idea. So here's where you would think that someone who's been teaching and studying philosophy of mind for 30 years would have a lot to say, right? I have one thing, which is, so you might say, we talk about creativity and extend it to DALL-E. It's sort of a derivative way of talking about creativity. Really, in order to be really creative, you need to be the type of thing, one needs to be the type of thing that is possible to attribute the whole package of psychological, intentional, cognitive, mental concepts and terminology to. That being creative is only possible for something that also thinks, that also understands, that also feels, that perhaps has emotions, maybe even a moral sense, that the whole collection of psychological vocabulary and our concepts of it is sort of a package deal. So it's really only something that can have all of these things together. They could even count as, in the primary sense, being creative. So sure, I say things like, my car wants a wash, but my car doesn't really have desires. It doesn't have that, it's not capable of being really explained in terms of beliefs and desires, right? Or my computer thinks that it's going to rain today. Well, you might think, I'm not sure that might be an extended use of thinking. And so the thought is behind this sort of package deal way of thinking of our mental vocabulary, including things like creativity, that you have to have all of it in order to have any of it, or most of it in order to have any of it. And that's sort of mirrored by what we might think about art on the paradigmatic way of understanding that I started the talk with. You might think the artist doesn't just generate things that match some sort of idea. There's a whole understanding, there's sort of deep reflection on the human condition and or some aspect of the human condition that all comes together in an intentionally guided, explicitly intentionally guided process. And so that way of understanding art and art making suggests that this way of attributing creativity to DALL-E is really just an extended way of doing that. Okay, but I think if you reflect on actual human cases, there are cases where we attribute some but not the full panoply of cognitive or mental capacities. Children, as they emerge from infants to full adults, have certain mental capacities but not others. So arguably before they acquire theory of mind, they might have the cognitive capacity to negotiate material objects, but they don't have any sort of social intelligence. Until they acquire the concepts, psychological concepts themselves, they have certain types of mental capacities, and they have them not in some sort of derived way. They genuinely have them, but they lack others. Or people on the decline in cases of cognitive pathology. Sadly, if you've ever lived with anyone like that, I have, it still can make sense to attribute certain types of mental capacities. Make sense and be useful to attribute certain types of mental capacities without others. So reasoning or thinking, reasoning, rationality might go even if perceptual response and maintains itself. So there are, around the edges, there are cases where I think that tell against this sort of package deal way of thinking of the mental. Animals are another case. If you think animals are capable of various accomplishments that are cognitive, that are mental, and the animal mind literature is exploded with all sorts of what seems to be evidence for that. That too is a case where you might think it's not a package deal, that you can have agents that have some, things that have some but not all of the capacities that we think of as mental. Okay, so this, I have this in, I put this in green and not red because I want to think of it as a friendly problem. It seems to me that the challenge that this current generation of AIs is posing is precisely this question of how we can understand and understand them as, whether we can understand them as partial agents. There are older debates in philosophy, well, really going way back, starting with Turing, but in the 80s, about whether someday some sort of system artificial system that does all of this stuff, or seems to do all this stuff, can be said to have minds. That's an interesting, whether there could be general intelligence an artificial system could have. It's a very interesting question. But that's not, what's interesting now, it seems to me, is we're not there yet. We're at this interesting intermediate stage, and it's really interesting to ask about our concepts, which aren't developed to handle partial agency, whether they can intelligibly be revised, applied or revised in order to handle it. And that, I think, is exactly what's going on with computer-generated art. Okay, I'm going way too long, so I'll just quickly mention a third pushback would be just to say, maybe there's collective agency. Maybe we should think of Theo and DALL-E together as creating the image. So there are precedents for this. It's a terrible reproduction. So Rembrandt, you know, these 17th century artist guilds, they would have these studios that would be not just the great artist, the master artist, but full of apprentices. And it gets pretty murky who is responsible for what. Rembrandt put his name on a lot of stuff, but there were some assistants, apprentices, doing, in certain cases, a fair bit of the heavy lifting, the artistic heavy lifting. And even at the time, it's acknowledged. So this is his famous, the sacrifice of Isaac is in the Hermitage. This is a version of it, which is in a museum in Munich. And it even says they don't know what to say at the time. They say Rembrandt changed and painted over. So that's the acknowledgement of a sort of collective artistic attribution, right? Now, and with a movie, here's Dune. There's all these people, and we have a sort of a culture, a way of apportioning credit with regard to certain roles. There's a political dimension to that. I mean, the producers always get high billing, but we have a sense of how the film, if you said, who made the film? Who created the film? You might say the director, but you also might say, well, the sound was done by the music was done by so-and-so, the cinematography by so-and-so. We have an established practice that goes against the paradigm of apportioning credit. Okay, so maybe we can do the same thing with generated art. It's Theo and DALL-E, and there isn't an artist, there's a collective. Problems with that is you still need collective creativity comes in hierarchies, so it's messy. Maybe it can be made legally tractable with a notion of work for hire. So, you know, the copyright to Dune is held, I assume, by, well, it's probably held by a studio. Maybe it's held by a person, but the work that went into it by other people was negotiated under a contract such that the copyright would go to one person. So you might say Theo and DALL-E created the image together, but the copyright should go to Theo as a human on a work for hire type of way of thinking. But there's a messiness that I think maybe could be resolved. The deeper problem, though, is that I think this doesn't get rid of this puzzle about partial agency. All of the people in making Dune are full agents. They're fully people. Now, there's a question about, should we include all of them as the creators? Do we include the caterers and the people that paint the sets along with the costume designers as part of this collective or not? There's some vagueness, there's some indeterminacy there maybe even, but they're all full agents and they all contribute in some way to some task that is part of the art making task. If you go this route, this collective route with Theo and DALL-E, you still have this problem that, well, so what's DALL-E doing exactly? DALL-E's not a full agent. So how do we understand DALL-E's contribution? So, okay. Let's see. I don't need to go through this. This is just, we've seen ways in which you might argue that Theo is the artist. You might argue that DALL-E is the artist. You might argue that the artist is as it were, a collective. And these all provide ways out of the antinomy. Most of them involve denying this claim. But there's some of them that, it depends on whether you think that, for example, DALL-E is a partial agent can count as an artist. You might say this is a work of art, but deny this premise on the grounds that a partial agent can create art, but not count as an artist. That would be a sort of conceptual revision. But all of these ways out, I think, I hope I've shown that there's problems with all of these different ways out. There may be other ways out, things I haven't thought of, but it's a complicated and fraught dialectic that bears on this antinomy. Okay, so some conclusions, some speculations. First of all, it doesn't seem like looking at our current existing art making concepts or vocabulary, concepts like creativity, artwork, artist, and artistic credit, is going to reveal some way out of this puzzle. I'm just sort of claiming that, but it doesn't seem like more sort of conceptual investigation is going to resolve the antinomy. The antinomy might be involved by revising, by, for example, saying that maybe not all artworks need to have artists because partial agents can create them. Or artists could be, or creativity is something that could be had by a partial agent. There are ways out of the antinomy which involve revising our concept so that the antinomy no longer applies. And the crucial point is, if that's right, I think there are different possible ways out. That is a matter of choice. It's a matter of social choice. So how our concepts get revised as generative AIs emerge and challenge institutions like copyright and artistic credit will be a social decision, might be an implicit social decision, one that's driven just by social forces that might be more explicitly institutional. The US legislature, if they could do anything, I mean, this would never happen right now, but they could actually pass a law revising the understanding of copyright, for example. And that would be a social decision which would be driven presumably by commercial, economic, cultural, and cultural effects and implications. And there's a slide I didn't show where the Supreme Court, commenting on the role of copyright and fair use, says pretty much explicitly that it's a mechanism that's supposed to maximize creativity. So it's not about preserving individual artistic credit, which is sort of what I thought it was. On the Supreme Court's conception, we use the copyright mechanism so that there's creativity. Okay, so the effects of these changes, and I'm saying, or just claiming, speculating, that there's going to have to be some sort of conceptual revision in order to handle and adjust to this next generation of artificial generative and highly sophisticated art-making non-human AIs. And those effects, those will have legal and economic effects. It'll be interesting to see just in like 2 or 3 years what happens to the publishing industry and AIs when these lawsuits start working their way through our system. And I want to say that the emergence of generative AI-aided art is probably going to change things in the same way the camera arguably, or it will change things arguably in the same way that, or maybe in the same way that the camera changed things. The invention of the camera led not just to the establishment eventually of a new art form, photography, but also to revisions in other artistic practices, like portraiture. Portraiture didn't go away, but portraiture, I think, was transformed by what went on in portraiture was transformed in certain ways by the emergence of the camera and photography. I think it's going to be the same type of thing with AI-aided art. It's going to affect the way we practice art. So my speculation is that generative AIs will change art, but I'm confident that they won't bring about an end to it. When anyone says, I'm confident that P, you should think they're actually a little worried about P, right? So there's sort of a negative. My worry is the better the AIs get at doing the art thing, the less interested we're going to be. So if there's an AI that can produce perfectly, aesthetically wonderful images, I might cease to be interested in them because I'm interested in these things as expressions and maybe communications with another human, not with an AI. That's the sort of negative worry, is that AI-generated art is going to make some of these art forms and maybe art in general go away. On the positive side, though, art and art making is pretty much a human universal. I think you see it going way back. You see it in all cultures in some form or other. And so presumably generative AI is going to be a highly transformational, highly influential change maker to artistic practice, but it won't make art go away because there's always going to be that need. Okay, so that's, I cut out about 2 hours of the talk, but that's, so thank you. That's all I got. Questions, comments, strong objections? Gilles.
So, thank you. Two questions. Sorry, oh yeah. Yeah. So two questions. One, I mean, what is the legal or the copyright status of a prompt? Because you can imagine that writing down a prompt is in itself an expression of an idea and not just the output. And if you attribute intellectual property to the prompt, then you have the simple rule of antecedence, something that works like like the NFT, for example. Whoever comes first. If I want to create an image, liberal arts philosophy professor with antlers, for example, if I'm the first one to do that, then I can claim copyright on it. And second, if we sort of circumscribe the question of generation of image to art production, there's also the element of status of the producer of those images, right? You alluded to that when you spoke about Duchamp, is he worked very hard to establish himself as an artist, which enabled him to make his act of, posing a urinal on a pedestal as a credible, work of art. But if I did it, no one would, pay attention. Or if I just, decide to reverse it, that would not qualify as. So I'm wondering, where does, the status, the context of production, of artistic production comes, in your discussion?
Okay, great. Yeah, great. Thank you. Very great question. So with regard to the second, yeah, I mean, people often think with Duchamp's fountain, the urinal, I could have done that, right? Or the blank canvas of, I could have done that, right? Or John Cage's 433. I could have done that, but you couldn't have done that because you had to have a certain status in order to have that be accepted as a move in the art world, in the institutions of art. In order to have that accepted as a thing that could be treated as and evaluated as art. So I'm just sort of seconding this supports the institutional theory, right? The institutional theory emphasizes exactly that type of thing. Duchamp was able to do this through being an established artist and through chutzpah, basically, was able to, and that's real work, and that's real, well, it's work, and it's also depends upon status, stuff like that. So yeah, I don't know quite what to, that's definitely part of the institutional theory, and emphasizing those details shows that there's sort of more work, as it were, that goes behind, brings out how there's more work that goes behind these types of artworks beyond just the creation of the object, which Duchamp had nothing to do with, right? But your first question is really interesting. I have no idea, but I suppose you could, if your prompt was like a poem or something like that, right? So if I put into chat to DALL-E, suppose I just put in Coleridge's Kubla Khan or something like that, and see what DALL-E, we could do it, what DALL-E spits out, right? Now, I don't know. I mean, I suppose I think that, I don't know the legal status. I suppose one thing the Supreme Court might say is the poem is being put to a transformative use. It's not being used as a poem. It's being used as a prompt. So it's fair for me to use, it's fair use. It overrides, Coleridge is long gone and his poem is out of copyright, but it transforms any copyright. But even if I could, so suppose I generate some really cool prompt and it generates an image, it's true that I think I might maybe I could have copyright to the prompt itself. I'm not sure about that. But I'm not sure that I think still at least the way the law is now, they would distinguish between my copyright to the prompt and my copyright to the image that is the result of that prompt.
But it's a new profession. I mean, people are getting paid money.
That's true.
Right, the prompts. So
right.
Imagine that there's a regime of legal protection that comes with this.
Yeah, I just don't know. But yeah, all these issues. Yeah, as I say, I'm limiting myself to visual art and visual images, and particularly visual art. But you're absolutely right. I mean, some of these same AI is not just changing the way we think about all different modes of production, but is not just changing the way things are produced, but is also changing the occupations that surround, human occupations that surround it.
I wanted to ask, with your example of Theo, he simply puts in hippie philosophers and it generates an image. Actually, with a lot of the Gen AI technologies, it's an iterative process. It's not a single, sort of prompt that's given. So how does that complicate his agency in creating the image according to the kind of problems that you present?
Right. So my example sort of, you might think it's sort of a cheat because I say Theo just, and doesn't even put any thought into it, right? So it really seems like Theo's not doing much work. I assume that this guy actually does a lot of careful prompting, is a skilled prompter, and there's an iterative process that gets him to, this is behind the generation. So there's a lot of work that the human, Charlie Engman, is doing there in the prompting, in the subtle. So the only points I was making about that is that so far as I can tell, there's still this idea expression distinction that prohibits him from having any copyright to the image. Just as, whoops, I'll go way back to the graphic novel. She may have, for all I know, she may have sorry. There. Christina Kashtanova. Has anyone read this? No. She may have put a lot of prompting and revision and stuff in the same way Charlie Engman did to generate those particular images. But at least the way it is now, the Supreme Court's like, that's all idea. It's not expression of idea. Expression of idea was carried out entirely. But so that's the type of shift that I think would be made. And the second point I was trying to make with this example was that on the institutional theory emphasizes the sort of social aspects, but doesn't emphasize the sort of material aspects. And with a case where there is a lot of iterated prompting, you might think it's not social work that's being done that needs to be reconceived. It's really conceptual work, and it's sort of first order artistic work. And that needs to be change to be acknowledged. That's sort of what I was trying to say. Yeah.
I just want to clarify one thing. The two images, hippie philosophers and hippie philosopher star, did you intend for them to be exactly the same, or?
Absolutely, yeah.
So could Theo have asset from Dali, and Dali grabbed Arta's image from off the internet and presented it to him unchanged?
So I am just thinking of these as two totally separate things where they happen. These happen to be perceptually identical. They're doppelgangers or twins.
They do not spring from the same source.
I mean, actually, they did. Right? I just copied that, but they do not spring from the same source. Now, I see what you're getting at. So there is a problem here with my argument against the input artists. It seems right to me that in a case where I just prompt hippie philosophers in Cubist style, Picasso and all those people shouldn't get any credit. But what people actually do is they'll say something like, create a image of a banana in the style of Sarah Anderson, right? Or even create, if Sarah Anderson has an image of a child, create an older child in the style of Sarah Anderson. There, I think we start to get uneasy, right? We think that the AI is infringing upon the commercial viability, is going to undermine Sarah Anderson's livelihood and creative activity, right? Now, in the law, luckily, there's sort of a lacuna in the law. That's a trademark issue. So if Liam creates something that is in the style that could be, he could pass off as representative of my style because I'm a well enough known artist, then that's a trademark infringement. You're violating my trademark. So this is what's going on with like the fake Drakes in the music domain, right? There's that fake Drake that went viral, and it's not a copy of a particular Drake song. It's a copy. I mean, I think used Drake's voice and style, and so it seems like an infringement. Now, under the law, that would be a trademark infringement, not a copyright infringement. I don't know whether that sort of helps us out, right? And but that's coming too. I mean, that there are cases where people are, and that's really the worry. I mean, like in the New York Times OpenAI type of case, what the New York Times is worried about. I mean, they're worried about everything, but not just that the information goes in, and then I might say, you know, how many Syrians are refugees right now? It's more like, what does the New York Times say today about Syria? And then it kicks out basically the New York Times article. That's an infringement. I think that would be seen as a copyright infringement. I don't know if that gets at your.
Yeah, so that's part of what I wanted to think.
Yeah.
Here, but there's a question between, I mean, I've seen things come out of DALL-E which are substantially similar to existing artworks, right?
Right.
If you don't transform it enough, right? And that's what it comes down to, I think, in many cases, is when does it become transformative compared to the original?
Right.
But in the case of Arta, she understood the style and had broken down pieces into that style and then reconstructed them for something original.
That's the thought.
Describe it, yeah.
Right.
And this is I saw a biography of Picasso last year. He went to Paris and spent his early years doing portraiture in the style of other famous artists.
Right. Which is fine as part of a learning process, right? But if you're passing those off as, and they're being accepted as sort of knockoffs, then it becomes forgery, right? But this is exactly the murky issue. And I think the Supreme Court is, the way they see it is, they want to balance creative livelihoods and stuff. And so I thought going into this, copyright is just a legal reflection of some deeper intuitive notion of artistic credit. I don't think that's the way. And I think in European intellectual property law, there's a bit more of that. Things like moral rights and stuff. But in US copyright, it's really almost this utilitarian way of just trying to promote livelihoods and creativity in general.
Just to distinguish, Picasso wasn't doing forgery.
No,
Doing
right.
people's portraits
In a learning,
prior, and
right.
they would ask him to do it in the style of a certain artist.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
I guess, so at the end, you kind of said something about how if we kind of end up in this world where there are all these images, we'll become less interested in them because we don't think there's anyone on the other side of the image
I'm
talking
worried
to
about
us.
that, yeah.
And I guess I have a question in the sense of like, I guess you brought this up early on about nature and how we find natural things beautiful. And most people might say there's no one on the other side of the natural image. Or
There's
maybe
a long tradition of thinking that there is some person on the other end. But
So I guess, do you think that's just, do you think like the thing with the relationship we have with natural images is only a kind of a remembrance of kind of like God talking to us or something like that? And that like, I guess like in the sense like, can we serve, I guess it seems like we have this body of images without people talking to us. Is it just that we used to think that way? Or is this like a different way of engaging with like art or something like that?
Do you mean in the natural case or the?
I mean, we have this natural case, right?
Yep, the beautiful snowflake.
Yeah. And you might say two things about that. You might say, oh, we're just in the habit of thinking that someone is sending a message to us through this art. And we're just like reacting in the habit of it. And we're wrong. Or maybe we're wrong in some way. Or we're not acting as if someone is talking to us or something like that. We're not acting as if this is a message, but we're engaging. Yeah. And I guess, do you think either of those cases is impossible for art, where we just like, we're still just in a habit of like thinking of these images as someone talking to us, or we just get used to like, I don't know. Yeah.
I think I see where you're going. So with the, so there's sort of this, so I mean, several things to say. This is all just sort of cultural cultural, historical, complete speculation, right? But I think it's quite natural for us now to say there's tons of stuff that's aesthetically wonderful that doesn't have there's no agency behind it at all, not even partial agency. I'm not sure that was always the case. I'm not sure, right? It could be that the aesthetic was tied more closely to agency, and particularly to, because there is an overextension. I mean, you can almost, like animism in a way is an extension of agency to natural objects. So stripping agency from, seeing agency as important for just some things that are aesthetically and not all things that are aesthetically valuable itself might have emerged with this sort of natural philosophy, the way of understanding nature. I don't know about that, but right. So if we think about the snowflake, I think we want to say, and this is a little murky too, many people want to say, it's not even created. It doesn't really make sense to say it's created. It's beautiful, it's novel, it's unique, but it's not creative because it's not brought about by a certain type of constrained process. And I think what you're asking, Griffin, is whether someday we might get to art, is think about art in the same way that we think about natural beauty, that there could be artworks without artists. There, I don't know what to say, except that, I mean, the difference there is that when you're aesthetically evaluating nature, there's a framing problem. Who took my, well, we'll get there in aesthetics. I don't know if, there's a framing problem. You're not really given a way to, where the thing that you're evaluating ends, what the dimensions of evaluation are, in the way that you are with an art form. With an art form, you know, because it's a social interchange, that it's not an aesthetically relevant feature of a painting, or at least traditional paintings, how far out it sticks from the wall, right? That's something that is a relevant feature of bas-relief or sculpture or something like that. But as a two-dimensional art form, you know that. You also know this sort of exploratory space type of stuff. I know what counts as a fugue. So in some sense, I have a framework to evaluate a new Bach fugue. Because it's a social, it's generated by a person and received by an artist, by an audience, it's a bit of, it's almost like a communicative act, right? There's assumptions about on both sides. And that's a sort of, I think the way we think of art as opposed to other forms of aesthetic, other objects of aesthetic evaluation, it has that dimension. The frame, some of the background framing that tells you what the relevant way of understanding it and evaluating it is sort of built into the cultural communication. A long-winded answer, but okay, maybe one more question and then I'll let everyone go. Or no more questions. Okay, well, thank you all so much. Lot to think about, and I will see have a great mini break, everyone, including the aesthetics students. And those of you in aesthetics, we're going to take up the intentional fallacy on next Thursday.